It's really an honor to be here with you today. Let me share my slides. Lots of pictures from you for you guys. So I'm going to be talking about the research I've been doing over the last 6 years on Charmian Kittredge London. I'm pretty sure that most of you know who Charmian Kittredge London is. She just mentioned that she was Jack London's second wife, but she was so much more than that. And part of the reason why we don't know who she was or didn't know a lot about who she was is because the story of her life was told often through the perspective of Jack London, her famous husband. So what my research focused on was to no longer look through that lens and to use primary documents and do archival research outside of the traditional research that had been done on Jack London. And one of the guiding quotes that I use is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the poet W.S. Merwin. He's one of my favorites. In his really monumental book, The Lice, in a poem called It Is March, he says, when you look back, there is always the past, even when it has vanished. And I think that's a lesson in the West that we definitely have to think about. I think we're taught this onward movement, consume everything. And we only remember, except for obviously the people in this room are concerned with the past. But as a general rule, the society doesn't remember everything from the past, only, the people who wrote it down. So my job as a biographer has been to focus on subjects that have been erased, that have been vanished, and to find that trace of them that's still there. So I grew up in Sonoma County, and when I was in the 6th grade, I went on a field trip to Jack London State Historic Park. And before that time, I really didn't pay attention in school at all. All I did was write in my journal and glue pieces of paper together and call them a novel. And that was what I did in class. And I didn't know what that was until I went to Jack London State Park and I saw Jack London as this person who lived a life as an author, who was able to travel the world and write about it. And I was like, sign me up. That's exactly what I want to do with my life. But little did I know that on that day, I not only met Jack London, I also met another writer who was not named as a writer at the park at all at that time. I met Charmian Kittredge London. Now, Charmian was born on November 27th, 1871 in Wilmington, California, and she died on January 14th in 1955 in Glen Ellen in the cottage on the London Ranch in Glen Ellen, California. Here's some classic photos of her that I love. The one on the left is her in 1900, the same exact time that she met Jack London at Young's restaurant across from the Ferry Building. And she was a stenographer working in an office at a time when few women worked in offices and making a good living. She had an assistant who reported to her. And so when she met Jack London, he was a little rough around the edges. And she looked like this. She was, a really very fashionable and, basically somebody, corporate woman, so to speak. The second photo here is her in Waikiki. This is when Jack and Charmian were sailing around the South Seas on the Snark. And this is her swimming. She was sure to beat Jack in many endeavors there. She was very competitive. And it's in Waikiki that they both learned to surf. And when Jack told that story, he, of course, erased Charmian from that narrative because he wanted to sell a lot of copies of the story. And if people learned that she had learned to stand on the surfboard first, they wouldn't have thought he was so manly. At the third picture here is of Charmian at the wheel of the Dirigo, which is the ship that they sailed from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. And it was a really spectacular trip. Charmian wrote about her experiences on the Snark, and it became a very successful book, The Log of the Snark. And she also wrote about their journey on the Dirigo. However, The Log of the Dirigo was never published. A few chapters were published. I got a few chapters published, but the full book has never been published. And this final picture is my favorite. It's a photograph of Charmian on the ranch working on the Log of the Dirigo. In fact, these actual documents that you see here are now in the Huntington Library, only you see that paper there with all the pins in it with, it's kind of like her sticky notes. There weren't any sticky notes, so she'd use pins to put her ideas together. And those were flattened. So they took out the pins when they put them in the archival folder. So we'll never know the order, in how they were arranged around her document. And it's little things like that made it very difficult to uncover Charmian. What's really fascinating about this photograph, though, besides seeing her at her desk, something that people did not think that she had in the House of Happy Walls, which is the building right behind me. I don't live there. It's at Jack London State Historic Park. I just borrow it as my background. But the upstairs exhibit now talks about her having a desk because we found this photograph. And we also found the site in the House of Happy Walls where she is, where she had a desk. And Hansel Meath is the one who took this photograph, a famous photographer. I don't know if you've ever read anything about her, but she and Otto Hagel lived in Sonoma County and were famous photographers that loved Jack London and Charmian London and came to the ranch to photograph her. So one thing that led me to this project of writing about Charmian was this photograph. This is a very famous photograph of Jack London on a hillside. It's on Sonoma Mountain, which means it's the beginning of the world in Pomo culture. So this photograph, which is also on the trash cans at Jack London State Park, was no one ever thought about who it was attributed to. And when I was doing research about, I was poet laureate of Sonoma County, and so I was researching the history of Sonoma County for my work, and I came across Nell Griffith, Nell Griffith Wilson, who was a poet. She was also the daughter of the grandfather of the Gravenstein apple, for those who like apples. But she was a poet who lived in Kenwood, and she asked Charmian to contribute some information for this book of poems that she was putting together, called Our Valley of the Moon in Poems and Pictures in 1941. Charmian gave her this photograph and told her that she had taken it. And so you'll see that this photograph says, "Photo by Charmian London." Now, when I saw this, I was like, what? She took that photograph? And I immediately went to some scholars who were experts in Jack London, and I asked them, have you ever seen evidence of this before? Did you know Charmian took this photograph? And they were like, I never thought to ask that question. So that's kind of where my research started, was like, what else did we not think to ask about Charmian, about what Charmian did as a part of Jack London's life, because we never thought about it from her perspective. So that's where I started my research. And from that, I published 2 books. The first one is the biography, Charmian Kittredge London. I'll be reading little excerpts from that tonight. And the other one is my book of poems. It's a lyric biography. Each section of it is arranged like an archival box. And the first archival box is on biography. And it explores the spaces in between the archival documents that I worked with, learning Charmian Kittredge London's life. For example, the time that she spent in Oakland and Berkeley in her 20s up to her 30s was a lot of that information, especially around pre-1906, was really hard to find. And so it took a lot of investigation. It took a lot of work. And what I would find was very emotional, because it was things that other people had not discovered, had not included as part of her story, because it hadn't been available. So this is Charmian's home. I'm going to start by reading a little bit about Charmian's early life. I do start my book, my biography, telling the story of why Charmian was erased due to Irving Stone's biography about, his fictional biography about Charmian and Jack. I then jump forward to talking about Charmian's parents, who are fascinating. But after her mother died when she was just about 6 years old, she was sent to live in Oakland with her Aunt Netta and Uncle Roscoe. And her father had been friends with Roscoe, and her mother's sister is Netta, and that's why she ended up there. So this is called A New Life in Oakland. The 6-year-old in the black ruffled cashmere dress who stepped off the train into the steam-clouded platform in Oakland in the spring of 1878 did not remember the aunt who greeted her. It had been 2 years since Charmian had spent any time with her Aunt Netta in San Fernando, but she bravely took her aunt's hand and walked into the next chapter of her life. "Hurry up, child," Netta likely scolded as they cut through the crowded platform to their carriage. This was the first of many orders Charmian would be expected to follow now that she was a part of the Ames household. Charmian's life in the clapboard house at 554 35th Street in Oakland was vastly different from her previous life. After her years of turmoil and upheaval, moving from place to place as her father took on business ventures, and then as her mother's health deteriorated, the Ames's household felt shockingly quiet and uncongenial. The house had a big bay window that looked out to the busy street and a garden in the back filled with lilies, and she even had her own bedroom. But the home environment inside was anything but relaxing and comforting. Netta kept no art in her house because she believed that the best painting one could find was what one could see framed by a window. It was a household built on rules, where what you ate and how you acted was always monitored. The Ameses were very strict vegetarians. They viewed health holistically and practiced natural hygiene as promoted by Russell Thatcher Trull, MD. In the evenings, Roscoe and Charmian would gather in the front living room under the blush of a rose-tinted lamp for Netta's biblical or poetic recitations. Afterward, Netta would fill the room with music played on her Etsy reed organ, like The Dying Poet by the Cuban composer Louis Moreau Gottschalk. Even though Charmian felt uncomfortable and lonely in her new surroundings, she could lose herself in the music as she nestled in the shadowy old sofa near the stove. She begged her aunt to teach her how to play, but this request was met with another rule: wait until you are 9, and then I will teach you music. On Sundays, the family regularly attended the First Congregational Church in Oakland, where Charmian found herself enraptured by the music and the sermons of Dr. John Knox McLean. Dr. McLean inspired his audience to explore and appreciate the beauty of the outdoors, and his sermons stressed political topics such as equality for women. As soon as Charmian got home, she rushed to her bedroom to recreate the songs and lessons with her glass-eyed china dolls. These moments reveal, quote, a secret life. She had begun to live in rebellion against the rigorous and arbitrary rules of the Ames household. As she later reflected, quote, the beauty of things moved me more deeply than anyone knew. In fact, it was my secret life. Sunday school services with my dolls after the midday meal of cornmeal and mush and rice and rich milk, and I passed on the lesson of the day to the puppets. What Netta and Roscoe failed to perceive behind the child's obedient behavior was an imagination that thrived on beauty and fantasy. From an early age, Charmian saw the world imagistically, as her mother had. She remembered her Uncle Harley's wedding to his first wife, Sarah Prudy, where the sweet strawberry ice cream she'd eaten for the first time was the same color as the bright pink puffy sleeves of the bridesmaids' dresses. Or she remembered riding in a buggy with her aunt to her grandmother's farm when she passed an ancient windswept graveyard during a storm. She noted that the scattered headstones were framed by weeping willows on a hillside that a, quote, peculiar, unpleasant, yet gripping scent emanated from the earth. Later in life, whenever she passed a graveyard, she would smell the same reminiscent odor, even if no such odor existed. These early sensory impressions so touched her that they reoccur in her writing throughout her life. She would later call these moments beatitudes, or trespassing into little paradises of say, well-being, that all beauty and peace, but unshareable because they are made of my own soul stuff. The pleasure she took in experiencing her beatitudes continued to grow over the years, nurturing her creative impulse to write. Charmian's poetic impulse was nourished in the Ames' literary household. Very early, I moved in the high company of singers, living and dead. The best at hand went through the home. The volumes of the great ones were upon the shelves. In the next 3 years, as she settled into her life with her aunt and uncle, she read voraciously. When she read Tom Sawyer, she could immediately envision the banks of the Mississippi River as her mother had described them in her diary of her overland journey, which Charmian read and reread. Reading Twain, she imagined she, like her lost mother, stood on the banks of the powerful river. I'm going to move forward to when Charmian loses her father. So Charmian's father was, he went by Kit Wiley. I'm sorry, he went by Kit, but his last name was Kittredge, obviously. He lived in Los Angeles. He stayed in Los Angeles when she moved up to Oakland. And she missed him a great deal. They were very close. And he came up, he to participate in the grand procession of the 20th National Encampment of the Grand Army of the Republic in San Francisco on August 3rd, 1886. When he came to visit, he stayed with her, but he fell ill almost immediately. And a month later, he died. They sent Charmian out on an errand when they saw that he was dying. Her aunt even tried to control that and sent her out on an errand. This is that moment. The time Charmian spent caring for her father in the darkened bedroom was one of the most difficult periods of her life. On the day he died, August 27th, 1886, Charmian was sent by Kit's attending doctor to buy medicine at a nearby pharmacy. She was told to drive the doctor's phaeton carriage alone. The power she felt driving the small carriage behind the muscular horse through the busy streets of Oakland thrilled her. All at once, she felt she had realized her heritage, as she recalled later, mine own brave cavalry father, dad's own daughter. Oh, at last, a regular Kittredge. The ecstasy of that moment was utterly eclipsed by what she found when she returned. The bed that once contained her father was stripped and bare. Her father had died, and his body had already been removed from the house in her absence. Netta and Roscoe may intentionally have sent Charmian out of the house because they knew her father was on the brink of death. Netta often tried to control situations in this way. However, no one had considered how traumatizing it would be for Charmian not to be present when her father died. She was never able to say goodbye to the most important figure in her life. But driving the carriage had awakened a sense of freedom she would nurture in the years to come. Riding a horse identified with her father, and the side of her that came from the rocky coasts of Mount Desert Island. Kit had never been able to extricate his daughter from the grasp of the Wiley clan, but on the day he died, she began to manifest the Kittredge spirit, independence, a sense of adventure, and an ability to see change and adversity as challenges she could embrace. So after her father dies, Charmian learns shorthand. And this is when she starts working for her uncle Roscoe, who is actually a shorthand expert. He publishes several books on it. And then she uses those skills to get a appointment at Mills College. So she works for Susan Mills, and she works in her office as her secretary and gets free room and board at Mills College. After she leaves Mills College, she returns. She lives in Berkeley now. Let me get to the right slide. Here's Mills College. So you can see this is Susan Mills. This is the office where Charmian worked. This is Mills College at the time, which was the first college west of the Rockies to grant degrees to women. It was called Mills Seminary and College. And then this is what a dorm room looked like right here. That's where she lived. So I want to talk a little bit about Charmian during her time after she left Mills College, and she got a job in San Francisco as a stenographer. Exactly what I was talking about earlier in this presentation with that photograph. Sorry, pass me, please. So at Mills College, Charmian had developed a lot of hobbies, including she really developed her sense of playing piano. She gave concerts all through the Bay Area, but she loved riding horses. So when she wasn't practicing the piano, she was out riding a rented horse until she could save enough of her salary and rental property income to buy a horse of her own. In the Berkeley Hills, she insisted on riding astride. For a woman to ride astride or cross saddle was still a controversial issue, even though many young women were riding bicycles at the time. Charmian refused to ride side saddle because she found it both dangerous and cumbersome. But women's fashions were not intended for riding in this way. So Charmian decided to design her own split skirt, a skirt she converted into loose pants like culottes. And you can see in the photograph in the right-hand corner that she's wearing her homemade culottes. Rain Edward Bennett, a neighbor of the Ameses, wrote of seeing Charmian riding in Berkeley in the late 1890s when he was 8 years old. Quote, "The first glimpse of Charmian Kittredge sparked a bright, windy morning in Berkeley when, with tresses flying, she galloped past our cottage on Dana Street, astride a white horse, and shouted, 'I am a Valkyrie,' to a startled child, and vanished down the highway in a cloud of dust. Riding empowered her, so it is not surprising that Charmian identified with the Norse women warriors. On weekends, Charmian rode or sailed the San Francisco Bay with friends during the day and went to dances or the theater with friends at night. As she reflects in the book of Jack London, I occupied myself outside my office hours with University of California hops and proms and senior balls, to say nothing of weekend yachting on San Francisco Bay. Charmian was sensual, comfortable with her body, and her salary enabled her to purchase fashionable clothes that showed off the curves of her 5-foot frame. She was an excellent dancer, never lacked dance partners, and her charm and ease made her one of the most popular women of her set. On the dance floor, her chestnut hair glimmered and her dark eyes sparked with gold. Netta had raised Charmian to view her own sexuality as a, quote, healthy creative urge, and had taught her about birth control, which was then still illegal. Consequently, Charmian broke with normal moral expectations by having sensual relationships with some of the men she met at dances. One of the men Charmian dated during this period was Herbert Dugan, an affluent married San Francisco pharmacy owner. Charmian also became acquainted with men and also made some of her closest friends, including Pauline French, through Netta's connections to the writers and artists associated with the Overland Monthly magazine. Netta was now publishing her articles everywhere, from local newspapers to national magazines such as Harper's Weekly and Cosmopolitan, and working as a freelance writer for the revitalized and thriving Overland Monthly. Charmian assisted Netta by editing her articles for her, but she also wrote and submitted her own articles, including Arrival of Blind Tom in California, an essay about a small visually impaired boy who was a genius at playing the piano. The Overland Monthly, which was founded in 1868 and edited by Bret Harte until 1875, had launched the careers of many of the best-known Western writers, including Harte, Ambrose Bierce, and Ina Coolbrith. The monthly was relaunched in 1883 under the editorship of Millicent Shin, who aimed to define a place in the Pacific Rim for California and its writers. Authors such as Netta, who had thrived in the Overland crowd as far back as 1892, wrote articles that focused on such California landmarks as the Channel Islands and Mount Shasta. The second phase of the Overland fostered a community of intellectuals who were cultural leaders in the Bay Area. In the August and September 1892 issues, Netta wrote a two-part article called Staging Through Mendocino Redwoods, which was illustrated with photographs taken by A.O. Carpenter, who lived with his family and ran a photography studio in Potter Valley, present-day Ukiah. Through Netta, Charmian was introduced to him and his son, Frank, with whom she became romantically involved. Through Frank, she met his older sister, Grace Carpenter Hudson, a nationally acclaimed painter, best known for her painting Little Mendocino, a portrait of a Native American child. Their mother specialized in photographing the native Pomo people who lived among them in Ukiah. Grace's close relationship with her Pomo neighbors would greatly influence her career as an artist. She also worked as an illustrator for the Overland Monthly. In the summer of 1894, Charmian joined Frank in Ukiah for a photo shoot. They were to be the models for Grace's illustrations for the poem A Summer Idyll by L. Worthington Green. Later that year, Frank and Charmian camped with Grace, her husband, and other artist friends of theirs on the North Fork and Navarro River. Photographs taken of this camping trip show a vibrant young woman, well at ease, roughing it away from the comforts of city life. Charmian's romantic interest in Frank would fade, but her friendship with Grace, whom Charmian called Huddy, persisted until Grace's death in 1937. In 1895, Grace sent Charmian a small artist conch painted with the face of a Pomo child that Charmian would treasure and display in her room for the rest of her life. So I want to skip ahead. This is not in Oakland, but this is one of the Charmian Kittredge meets Jack London in the year 1900, and they intellectually connect at that time, but they don't become a couple until 1902. She, after going back east and visiting her father's family in Maine, and then going all around Europe on a tour, she comes back and is invited to one of Jack London's famous parties with the crowd up in the Piedmont Hills. And while she's there, she challenges Jack to a fencing match. And Jack is used to all the ladies that he fences with letting him win. But Charmian liked to win, and she fenced him and won. And he was so surprised, legend goes, that he ran over and kissed her. And from that moment on, their secret affair started. So they married. Of course, the complication was Jack was married and had 2 small children at the time. And Charmian, who I've already established, was not really, she was raised to think that having an affair with a married man was not really that big a deal. And so she didn't see the moral issues with what she was doing until later, after the fact, when she realized the impact of what she'd done to Bess and the small children really had done. But once Jack filed for a divorce, they got married in 1905. And a year and a half later, they went on a trip aboard the Snark. This is a small yacht that they had designed, and they planned to go around the world, but due to Jack's illness, they had to come back. I'm going to start by reading you a poem from my book of poems, Westfire Archive, about the cruise of the Snark. Like I said, these poems are written as a way to kind of process the artifacts, the erasure of Charmian. The poem is called Make Them Float in Your Mouth. Aboard the Snark, 1906 to 1907. If you want a story, look for it. Begin with the idea of 7 years. Imagine a boat. Build it from paper and ideas. Sail it into the hiss of lava as it enters the sea. When you reach your first destination, ride a 75-pound surfboard and fail all day. Watch the plantation workers cleave sweet fruit with machete again and again until the story you've told yourself begins to stutter and spit. Go to Molokai on the 4th of July and see for yourself the small girl who, missing a nose or an arm and covered with sores, wears sequin clothes and dances. You have to sail on, past empty pockets and bank accounts. Watch your itinerary dissolve in the water next to the Australian yacht converted for blackbirding. See the machete lines carved into the teak door. You have to lose all of your water and then be blessed with a storm. You have to endure sores the size of baseballs that seep and cling to your calves and thighs. You have to go upriver into the luscious green tangle of unknown until the flowers emerge, red, hibiscus-like, large enough to contain the whole sunset syrupy sky. You have to find that island, make it float in your mouth. So weird being on Zoom and not having any feedback from the crowd. I'm going to assume you loved it. How's that?
It's great. We had one comment that says this talk is fabulous. So.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for putting some information in there. Wonderful. So before I go on, I want to read you a little bit from the biography, because on the Snark tour, I told you that Charmian did write before she met Jack London. She published in the Overland Monthly. She also did a piece on Jack London for Sunset Magazine. And then when she was aboard, then she married Jack London. She got quite busy helping him work on his work. She started working on his work beginning with the Seawolf, including up to some books like the Valley of the Moon, which she actually helped write passages of. Something that hadn't been attributed to her until quite recently. But aboard the Snark, she was finally able, she was freed from her time being Jack's secretary and Jack's editor and Jack's social coordinator and Jack's, intellectual stimulant. And she was able to do her own writing. And she decided to begin working on the log of the Snark, which she began as soon as they started their journey. So I'm going to read you the first part of the journey. There were several books written on the Snark. There was Through the South Seas with Jack London, which was a collection of Jack London's articles that he wrote along the way. These are the ones that are like, look at me surfing, don't notice my wife next to me surfing. But also Martin Johnson wrote Through the South Seas with Jack London, which both Jack and Charmian were like, that didn't really happen. So they thought that he embellished some of the things. But he went on later to have an incredible, that book really launched him into a career as a travel writer. And he and Osa, his wife, became huge celebrities. And then Charmian wrote 3 books. She wrote The Log of the Snark, and she wrote Our Hawaii and Our Hawaii's Island and Islanders. So all of these books were written off material from the Snark journey. One of the things, so she'd always been, I'm going to start from this section here. She'd always been inclined to write down all that she saw around her, but on board the Snark, this impulse developed into a well-crafted book-length log of their adventure in the South Seas, and into another 2 books about the time she spent in Hawaii. Being at sea freed her of some of the duties of being Jack London's wife and gave her the opportunity to step back into her natural independence and her inclination towards travel writing. As she explained in a letter to her Aunt Netta, writing about the Snark voyage made her feel like herself again. Quote, I seem to be coming into my own, in a way, getting back some practical results of my literary atmosphere, which was all education, at home with you and yours, and the rigorous following up of that education in my life with Jack. Without office life to vex and distract, my life is now all education. The very living of it is such, and the work I do for Jack is practical education. And there's no let up. Wouldn't it be fine to go on writing? Perhaps I shall. So a few hours after they set sail, a wave soaked Charmian's typewriter, leaving it almost inoperable, and everyone on board became desperately seasick. She was only able to begin her log of her experiences on the trip at 3 days out, once the boat had reached deep water. It was the first time she'd ever seen deep water, and its purple hue was so otherworldly. It reminded her of the dreamlike images painted by Maxfield Parrish in the 7 Voyages of Sinbad the Sailor. Soon they encountered creatures she had never seen before, clouds of purple man-of-war jellyfish sailing on the water's surface, and many goonies, birds that looked like dark gray overgrown seagulls. 4 days into their voyage, the boat hit rough water, and they discovered that the Snark would not heave to. They couldn't fix the position of the helm and sail to make it possible for the ship to steer its own course without anyone at the helm. Someone would always need to be on watch. That day, they also discovered that the sea anchor had failed. So if a storm hit, it would be difficult to stabilize the boat. Jack was utterly disappointed, and so was Charmian. Their long dreamed of adventure was off to a rocky start. The inexperienced crew, many of whom had never been at sea, consisted of the captain, Charmian's uncle, Roscoe Ames, the cook, Martin Johnson, the cabin boy, Tochiki, and Bert Stoltz, the engineer. Charmian was the only woman in the confined space of the yacht. She spent many frustrating hours on her hands and knees, scouring the greasy littered floors of the engine room, the bathroom, and the 2 staterooms, which had not been cleaned before they left port. As she records in her diary, we are all filthy on the filthy boat. Except for Jack, the sick and demoralized crew still couldn't leave their bunks. So much of the work fell upon her. She had known life at sea would be difficult, but was most surprised by the number of bruises she acquired from falls and bumps on the ship. Every inch of her seemed to be black and blue. As she records in the Snark, the smallness of the boat, the nearness of the water, and particularly the size of the waves would about wreck a nervous woman. Charmian, however, as she would record in the log, was not a nervous woman who needed special treatment. She quickly grew into what was required of her in her new life at sea. Her uncle Roscoe, who was supposed to be in charge, proved unsuited to be a leader. He was unable to get the sickened crew to do anything, and though he had experience navigating boats on San Francisco Bay, he had no idea how to navigate the boat's course in deep water. Not surprisingly, Cyrus R. Teed's cellular cosmogony, which is what he was using as a way to navigate by navigating not the sky, but towards the center of the earth. Didn't work. Couldn't help them find their course. Charmian was disgusted by his inaction and selfishness. Jack was furious. He unseated Roscoe as captain and made a contract with the rest of the crew to create order on the boat. Things improved, but the 26 days it would take them to sail to Hawaii would be filled with mishaps and misadventures that left both the Snark and its crew in desperate shape when they finally approached the harbor at Honolulu. Evenings, as the wind pushed their yacht forward, Charmian would sit with Jack watching the copper-streaked sky before the sun set and the sky filled with the clarity of stars. Charmian, who had carefully selected books she would read on board the Snark, read and heavily annotated Isabella Lucy Bird's book, The Hawaiian Archipelago, 6 Months Among the Palm Groves, Coral Reefs, and Volcanoes of the Sandwich Islands, 1875. Bird, like Charmian, was a woman not bound by conventions. She rode astride and often dressed in trousers. Although her book was written over 30 years before the Snark journey, it is no wonder that Charmian resonated with the work of a woman with whom she had so much in common. Such works gave her access to a literary tradition that helped shape her own writing. While on board, Charmian quickly realized that normal female attire would not allow her to do the work she needed to do on the boat. So she began wearing her, quote, blue flannel bloomers. She began wearing her blue flannel bloomers instead, pants she had made for working aboard the boat. When Jack saw her wearing pants on deck, he admired her androgyny, calling her his, quote, twin brother and sweetheart. Somehow, in the confined space of the Snark, they found privacy enough to make love, and Charmian records each lolly, as she called them, in her diary. So I'm going to take you towards the end of Charmian's life. I'm going to again start with a poem and then go on to, I'm keeping a track on time. I hope you guys are thinking of questions to ask me. Please do. I love questions.
We definitely do have questions. We have maybe
Good.
6 or 7 so far.
All right. Keep them coming, you guys. All right. So this poem is based on the photograph you see here on the left, which was also taken by Hansel Meath and Otto Hegel. I don't know which one of them took the photos because they labeled them as both of them. But I like to think that Hansel Meath took it. This is called Smiling into the Ruins of Wolf House. And just for those who, I think everyone probably knows, but Wolf House is that mansion that Jack and Charmian built that burned to the ground just weeks before they were to move in. They kept the ruins, and Charmian would visit them along with Jack's grave almost on a daily basis. So this poem is about this photograph of her. Smiling into the ruins of Wolf House. There are the tall trees that blaze in the night, hungry rockets of blue fire. Then there's the smoke that lingers like a question for years to come. What's left after the great fire are stones, still blackened and stacked, murmuring moss. When the photographers come to the ranch, he's been dead 30 years. Charmian stands tall in the doorway where once they had imagined a door, wearing a sweater the color of sky. She's smiling at the camera. She's surrounded by the ruins. You won't know this photo. This isn't the understory that was left to survive under the forest that's grown up around this ruin. It isn't written on placards at the state park. It has been buried in the innards of a cement building. Still, there she is at the threshold. Not a door, something more, something that seeds us as we pass. So at the time that Hansel and Otto visit Charmian, Jack has died in 1916, and this is in 1943. So she's been living on the ranch for a very long time and supporting the ranch, keeping it afloat, which was no small task. And also having a life as a writer, traveling the world, promoting Jack's work all around the world. The reason why Jack London has been translated into 52 languages has a lot to do with Charmian's work, globetrotting and promoting his work. So this is in 1943. Several years later, on a cool fall day in 1943, The young photographers Hansel Meath and Otto Hegel visited her at the House of Happy Walls. And that's a house that she built, the one behind me. After Jack died, several years later, she constructed this house as her monument to their lives. Although it did not contain her story until quite recently. This was just 5 years before Meath would become the second woman photographer to join the staff of Time magazine. Her husband, Hegel, worked as a freelancer for Life magazine and as President Franklin Roosevelt's official photographer. They'd recently purchased a ranch nearby and arranged to visit and photograph Charmian because they had long admired their work. Their documentary style photography was reminiscent of Jack and Charmian's photographic attempts to capture human dignity, especially in the people who had been cast off or forgotten by society. When they arrived, Charmian took the couple on her sacred walk to the hillside where Jack was buried in the nearby ruins of Wolf House. Photos from that day show Charmian posed in this ruin in front of the ruins of Wolf House, dressed in her rugged riding clothes, a wide smile spread across her face. When they returned to the House of Happy Walls, Hansel and Meath continued to take photographs of Charmian and the house. One photo in particular shows her seated at her desk in her large bedroom on the second floor, green visor pulled low. Her desk is covered with papers and books. Notes are pinned to pieces of paper as if she is physically trying to pull the story together. The threads she is following to fill the gaps in her story seem endless. She would continue to work. So right here, she's working on the log of the Virago, and she would continue to work on it until later that decade, she begins to develop dementia. She falls and breaks her hip. She has a stroke, starts to develop dementia, falls and breaks her hip, and then is unable to focus on larger projects like this book. But the book ends on a super happy note. There's one video clip of Charmian, and this is from when the movie The Sea Wolf was released at Sonoma's Sebastiani Theater. And there's a video clip of Charmian hosting the party at the ranch, and there's all these Hollywood stars, including Ronald Reagan, and she's wearing this red pantsuit with these big pearls, and she is so excited to be on camera. And I want to leave you with that picture of her as I end my book. I don't have the still shot, but I want you to imagine it in your minds, that Charmian and it was a pantsuit. It wasn't a dress. I think that's important because it was, by that time, it was completely acceptable for women to wear pants whenever they wanted. So these are my two books. I would love for you guys to purchase them if you're interested. There's two ways to do so. You can purchase a signed copy directly from me by going to my website, which is just irishjamaldunkle.com. And there's a page for Charmian London. And then there's a page for Westfire Archive, which is my book. And I'm happy to sign copies for you and send them to you. The postage is built into the price that you pay. Otherwise, there's links to the Amazon books. And if you ever see me, I'll happily find them later. So either way is fine. Just I hope you read about Charmian. So I'll move on to questions.
Thank you so much. I posted those links in the chat, so you should hopefully be able to just click on them.
Good. I'm going to stop sharing.
Instead of, cool. And Lisa Heyer also tells us that your book is available at the Jack London State Historic Park at the Museum Bookstore. Is that right? Yes.
If you go there, which I highly encourage you to, and you buy my book at the park, oftentimes they're signed copies. I go and sign them all the time, and you can have them put it aside for me to sign. But part of the proceeds go to the park. So please do, if you're planning on going to the park, please buy it there. I know Amazon is evil. I just put the links there because they're easy. You can also get them from local bookstores. You can order it through your local bookstore, or you can order it through the university presses. University of Oklahoma Press is the one that published my Charmian biography.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I know Walden Pond is always good about ordering books. That's a local option. So thanks for that recommendation. And yeah, please definitely check her book out. This was such a great presentation. It feels like, the poetry and the readings, and that you did a great job reading things, and just, yeah, it felt like a painting. So it was very cool. So
Thank you.
we got a few good questions from Andrew. Can you tell us about her first name? It's very unique.
Yes. So Charmian, and everyone says it different ways, but she said it as Charmian, like charm. And she is named, her mother chose it. It's what comes from joy. It's from ancient Greek. And when she had a child, she named her Joy, after her own name.
Thank you. We had a few questions about the address of the house again. We had, I think I misheard it. Is it still there? Do you have any more information you can tell us about it offhand?
So it is at 554 35th Street in Oakland. So the exact house is not there. But I would love someone in Oakland to take a picture of it and email it to me of what's there today. I'll put the address in the chat, and if you send me a picture, I'll send you one of my books for free. How's that?
Sounds like a deal.
Other questions?
We had one from Charles. Is she related to Frances Kittredge Shattuck?
I'm not sure of that relation, actually. She's related to mainly I don't think she is the Wiley clan was more settled in the area of Oakland and Berkeley. There weren't really any Kittredges. Her father was the only one. I mean, there are Kittredges, I'm sure, but not related to her. Her family was all the Kittredges stayed on Mount Desert Island. He came over in the gold rush, so her father, and stayed until right before his death. He went back for one visit. Good question, though.
Cool. Next question we have from Chris. Can you please tell us a little about your research techniques? You found such detailed information. The research seems incredible from just going from a photo. So could you tell us about that?
Sure. So the research was really, researching biography is like an endless hole you can go down, rabbit hole. I'm in a whole nother one now, and it's the same thing. I'm like, I'm not ready to write the chapter, but you have to start even before you have everything. So I'm sure there's things that I don't know that I want to know still about Charmian. And I love that about that. Like, I'll always be learning about her. The work that I did, I started, the work begins at the Huntington Library, where her main archives are, her archives are housed in the Jack London collection. Like most women of her era, her archives are housed under a male name. I looked at the archives at the park. That's the physical. I do a lot of research through physical artifacts because as a poet, it's really important to me to see the place where she lived. Like, I spent time in the House Happy Walls, and at the park, being there. Like, if I'm describing her riding her horse on Sonoma Mountain, I need to know what that feels like, and so I experienced it. But I also spent a lot of time in the local libraries. Oakland has an incredible library. Mills College was really helpful with that research. I did a lot of work finding collectors that had letters. Like, I found letters by Charmian's father about his time in Salt Lake City. That, it was so neat to be able to hear his voice, because no one had ever found like how he wrote sentences. He kept like a little book, but it was like, like date, time, action, like no narrative. So I was like, oh, who are you? And so I finally found Kit's narrative in his letters from some Civil War collector, like It's just a lot of work like that, a lot of census. I had an ancestry site for her. I read every single newspaper article of that era. I like a lot of local research, which you really have to do when you're doing stories about people who have kind of been eclipsed by other people. They get kind of hard to research. And a lot of records, as most of you probably know, from kind of the pre-earthquake era, are, especially from San Francisco, are lost. And it's a difficult time to write about, like the 1890s, early 1900s.
Thank you. I did get a message that Joanne, were you trying to ask a question in the chat? Feel free to, if you want to speak out your question, that's more than welcome. Give her a second.
She probably has to unmute.
Yeah. Yeah, let's see if I can ask her to unmute. Let's see. That will help.
To unmute.
There you go.
Yep, there we go.
Oh. Okay. My involvement with the life of Charmian has to do with the period up to London's death. Although I did visit when we visited the ranch a while ago, I spent a lot of time in her wonderful house that impressed me so much. But so of course I'm mainly concerned about the period before London died. London was a friend of my husband's father, Henry Anderson Lafleur, and I'm completing a biography of Lafleur.
Oh, wonderful.
But you say nothing, and it's obviously not important to you, about her disappointment in being able to bear a living child.
Oh, I don't say nothing about that. I spent a lot of time.
Well, you must say something about it in your book, but you didn't say anything today.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about that?
If you could say a few words about that, I'd be very interested.
Oh, yeah. Charmian, when they got back from the Snark journey, was feeling ill and thought she just was still sick from the journey. And turns out she was pregnant. And so 9 months later, she was told she was having a normal pregnancy. And she ended up giving birth to a healthy baby girl, Joy. And unfortunately, Joy was a really large baby, just like Charmian was a really large baby. Charmian was almost 10 pounds when she was born, and same thing with Joy. And Charmian was a small woman, and they had to use forceps to pull the baby out. And after that, Charmian had complications as well. And so when they pulled the baby out, they used forceps, and Joy's neck was broken, or her spine was broken. And she only lived for 38 hours. Charmian only got to see her child's face pass by her before she passed out, because she had was bleeding out on the table. And she had to have immediate surgery. And because of the surgery and the way it was done, she developed scar tissue. And even though she didn't know this at the time, she was never able to carry a child to term. So she had miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage after that. Right. She actually, so she never really got, so Joy died before she was able to really come to from her surgery. And when Jack told her, she was devastated. I mean, think about it. She's in a ward where the children are crying, her milk's coming in, and her baby's gone. And so her diaries from that time, I can't talk about it without crying, because reading her diaries during that period, as you know, I have 2 children myself, it's so horrible to read, because you can feel her grief just palpitates from the page. And knowing what, that later she's not able to have a child, even though she desperately wanted a child. In her diary, she kept diaries her whole life. Every single year, she marked Joy's birth date. Every month, she marked her birth, how many months she would be, until Charmian was towards the, her last diaries have Joy would be, 45 years old, it's heartbreaking. And
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Joanne, and I'm so happy to hear about the biography you're writing. But I want to say that one thing that happened in the House of Happy Walls, thanks to, them reading from the perspective of Charmian, is they included on the Trailblazer exhibit, which they called the upstairs exhibit on Charmian, they included one of Joy's baby booties, and her name is now in the exhibit, and she's named as a part of their lives because she was a real child to them, and important to them. So it's really great that she's there now.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you. Okay, we'll get back to we have a few more questions that we can get through, and then maybe if we do have a few minutes, if anyone has any additional live questions, we can get to those. I think you made this clear in the beginning, but hopefully we can get a recap just in case people didn't understand. The Jack London oak tree at the City Hall of Oakham, that's the same, she's the wife of the same Jack London that planted that tree. That's right? Cool. And then the poem that you read about the Snark, did you write that, or did Charmian write that, or can you tell us?
Oh, no, the poem is by me. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
No, so the poems in the book are written on, I wrote them off of the archives at the same time that I was writing the biography. So yeah, no, that's me. Charmian did write a little poetry, and I'm going to say she wasn't a very good poetry writer, just like Jack was not a very good writer of poetry. We'll just leave it at that.
Cool, thank you. We had a few questions about the journey on the Snark. Can you tell us about how long the journey was to Hawaii, how long the ship was, and maybe a bit more about their journeys, like how long did they spend on the boat in general?
Yeah, so they originally thought they were going to spend 7 years on the Snark, and it was only 2.5 years that they spent, because once they got to they started in San Francisco, which was delayed. After delayed, first delay was the earthquake. When they were building the boat got partially destroyed in the 1906 earthquake, and it was really hard to get lumber after the 1906 earthquake, as you'd imagine. So everything got delayed. They finally set sail, and on April 23rd, 1907, and they sailed from San Francisco to Hawaii. That took 26 days. From Hawaii, they went to the Marquesian Islands. They didn't know that they were going to hit the doldrums, and they did, and they ran out of water, and they nearly died on that part of the journey. They had a lot of mishaps. And then they, from the Marquesian Islands, they went to Tahiti. And when they got to Tahiti, they finally got mail for the first time, and they realized that all of their bank accounts were overdrawn, and so Netta was supposed to be taking care of everything, and they had to immediately get on a steamship and go back to Oakland and deal with everything, and then can take the steamship back to Tahiti and continue their journey. Now, when Charmian writes about this, she kind of erases that part, but there's always like 10 different ways she tells the story, and you have to, like most writers, you have to find the real truth between all those stories. So she had a diary, which was pretty truthful, because she didn't think anybody else was going to read it. And then she had the Log of the Snark journal, and then she had letters to Netta. So that was between the letters and her journals, you got to see the real side of how drunk Jack was getting, or what was really going on. And yeah, it was quite entertaining. I didn't include all of it in there. But then from there, they sailed on. They went to, I believe, several Tahitian islands, and went to Bora Bora, went to Samoa, and then on to the Solomon Islands. And when they were in the Solomon Islands is when Jack got really, really sick, and they ended up having to go to Australia thinking they were going to take a little break, but Jack couldn't continue. They had to sell the Snark, and they took a steamship via South America, traveled through South America, and went back to Glen Ellen via South America. So that's the Snark journey
Thank
in a
you.
nutshell.
Another question from Charles. These are great questions. Where was the house she settled in after the fire, and is it still standing? Is the video available to see?
The after the fire of Wolf House, is that the question?
I doesn't specify, but I believe so.
Can Charles speak to it? I want to answer correctly.
Yeah, Charles, do you want to ask your question?
If he doesn't, it's okay.
Okay, we can come back.
I'll just assume. I just assume that after Wolf House burned, they were living in the cottage, which is called the cottage on the ranch. So another building about a mile, half mile away from there. And they just continued living in the cottage. But the Londons actually spent very little time in Glen Ellen. They were traveling a great deal of the time. Or they, in fact, towards the end of Jack's life, they had 2 major trips to Hawaii that took up a lot of their time. So they weren't there much, or they were on his, on their little yacht. They were not yacht, little sail ship, but they were sailing ship, but they were going all around the Bay Area.
Cool, thank you. We have one question from Kitty Hughes. We recently lost the Cryer Boatworks to fire. It is not well known that the Cryers worked on London's boats, although not at this location. They may have worked on the Snark. Loss of this building was loss of an important local link to Jack and Charmian London. Do you know if they worked on the boat there? Or?
I don't. I know that the shipyard they had the Snark at the time of the earthquake was in Hunters Point. So I don't know if that's where the Cryer Boatworks was located at the time, but I'd love to know if that's I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'd love to know if someone knows the answer to that question. See, I'm always learning about Charmian.
Okay, we have one question from Catherine. Do we know who planted the oak tree in front of Oakland City Hall? Was it Charmian or was it someone else? Does anyone know the answer to that? Do you know the answer to that?
Wait, Lisa's waving her hand.
Yeah, Lisa, do you want to speak to that or something else?
Go ahead, Lisa. You got to unmute.
Maybe I need to unmute her. Let me see.
She really wants to talk.
I said ask to unmute. Okay.
Yes, so the tree is transplanted from Mosswood Park by present-day Kaiser's Hospital and the Fabiola Hospital, where I believe Charmian went for her maternal care, the original Fabiola Hospital. So the tree is a sapling moved from Mosswood by the mayor of Oakland at that time, which I believe is Davies.
Yes.
And the store, I don't believe, when we rededicated the tree a few years ago, I think that we discovered that Charmian was not at the tree dedication.
I don't think she was.
Yeah, it happens in like January or something, or maybe even a few months more after Jack's death in November of 1916. So.
Isn't the oak, the acorn, like, isn't the oak somehow related to the oaks on the ranch?
No, I don't believe so. It was just a nice little sapling at another City of Oakland park. But yes, the park did grow some saplings from the oak tree at the park, which actually Oakland did not take one. So there we go.
Okay. And you're right. It's Fabiola Hospital where she had Joy Baby. Yeah.
Yeah. Such a sad story.
So sad.
Yeah. Well, medicine was very difficult in those days.
And it's almost impossible to find those records.
I mean, it's all very ago. So thank you.
If anyone knows the secret of finding Fabiola Hospital's records, let me know.
Cool, thank you. We have a few minutes left. Does anyone have any additional questions? I believe that's all of our questions.
Those
Cool.
were pretty good questions, you guys.
Yeah. Maybe one last question. Can you tell us, a little bit about being a biographer, like how, what that's like, and how you find your next subjects and things like that?
Yeah, as Virginia Woolf says, biography work is like donkey work. It's a lot of hard labor.
Tell
But
me about it.
right, Joanne knows. But it's so satisfying. I mean, I just started about a year ago. I started working on my next biography, which is on the writer Sonora Babb, who wrote about the Dust Bowl. But whose book, whose names are unknown, was not published because John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath came out just a few months before and immediately became a bestseller, then won a Pulitzer Prize, blah, blah, blah. Turns out she had loaned her notes to, she worked at the camp at Arvin Sanitary near Bakersfield, and she loaned her notes to Steinbeck. Also, he saw her work, and she had a contract with Random House and they canceled it right after his book came out. So because of that, and her book didn't get published till 2005 when she was 98 years old. So I'm telling her story, which is fascinating. But again, I'm in the donkey work of spending times in the archives. I've spent a lot of time in Austin, Texas at the Harry Ransom Center, which is lovely. But you go through feet and feet and feet of correspondence and records and pictures, and you find like 3 treasures and you're like, oh my God, so that's what it's like writing a biography. But it's really, the process of, like, for example, knowing now that if a young girl like myself goes to Jack London State Park and goes into that exhibit, she'll see the story of a strong woman who was a writer, who kind of went against gender norms and lived a life that maybe that girl hadn't read about before or known about before. And that really makes all of this worthwhile, all this donkey work, and I really am grateful to the park for the work they've done in letting Charmian's story into, to be alongside Jack's story now. And it's become very popular for people to, get to know Charmian because they didn't know her before. And so I'm very grateful for the small role I got to play in that transition.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting story. It was interesting to see how she's kind of behind the translation of a lot of Jack London's books too. I didn't know that. That was pretty interesting fact. Switching back to Charmian, we have a couple more questions coming in. Did Charmian attend Oakland Public School? And do you know if she did, and which one?
I don't know which school she attended off the top of my head right now. I'm so sorry, you guys. She was homeschooled for a lot of her life by Netta. So I believe she didn't attend school until she went to Mills College.
Cool. And then Catherine asked the question, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think there was a correction. Catherine, I'll ask you if you want to unmute and I can let you ask your question. Let's see. And then that will be the last one.
Hi, I was just wondering, you're talking about the book that you're now doing the research on. And you said that the woman loaned her notes to Steinbeck. Are you implying that, and then she lost her ability to publish? Are you implying that Steinbeck sort of plagiarized her notes or something like that?
I have a essay published in the recent issue of Catamaran, and I'll try to find the link to show you so that you can read my whole essay, my first chapter about it. But yes, I am saying that he used some of the information from her notes, and I'm not saying that he plagiarized her. in any way, but I'm saying because his story was published, his novel was published before hers, and he didn't have the expertise of having lived in the camp and worked with the refugees. He also wasn't from Oklahoma like she was. He also set the Grapes of Wrath in a area of Oklahoma that did not experience the Dust Bowl. And so when I was growing up, my family's from Oklahoma and came over in the Dust Bowl. And I read the Grapes of Wrath in high school, and I was thrilled to read it. It was an amazing story. And I was like, Grandma, they read a story about our family. And she was like, I can't stand that book. And I was like, what's wrong with you? I mean, Steinbeck, it's amazing. And she's like, I'm not even going to read it. I mean, she didn't like the way that he represented Okies, to use that term that we're not supposed to use in my grandmother's world. It's kind of like these dumb people. The women weren't strong. And she didn't like the way that he said it in a place that didn't actually experience it. So in Charmian, oh my gosh, Charmian, in Sonora's, getting my subjects mixed up, in Sonora's version of In Whose Names Are Unknown, which is her novel, and it's published by University of Oklahoma Press. If you guys are interested in reading it, it's a fascinating novel, Whose Names Are Unknown. And in it, she spends a lot of time actually in Oklahoma. And so you get to know the people and what it's like to lose, like how much they love where they live, and they love being farmers, and they love this experience and why they're there, how they got there. And then when the dust storms come, it's like the disaster lit. It's like, just like when the fires came to Sonoma County, nobody was like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to be homeless, or I'm going to lose half the, this whole hillside's going to be gone. It's just what happened. It was a disaster. And because you are invested in these people, by the time they get to California, you don't see them as these dumb people that just ended up in this situation. You are really invested in them, and you're invested in the story, that it's not just the white men who are experiencing this, this story. It's also, there's the people working in the fields at the time are Filipinos, there's women, there's African-American people, there's Mexicans, just like the fields would have been multicultural. And there's people who are in leadership roles in, the unions and things like that are not just, the people that were depicted before. So sorry to go on my soapbox, but yes, that's what I'm saying a little bit. He's not plagiarizing, but he is, because of his work, her work was not published. And actually only a single story of the Dust Bowl was allowed, instead of really more of the truth to be allowed into the story. But I'm going to write a whole book about it. So I'll update you about it in a couple of years.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you send me that link, we'll send an email out after this presentation, and we can make sure to include that for people who are
Thank you.
interested.
I appreciate that. Yeah,
for sure. Okay, yeah, thank you so much again, and thanks for bearing with me in the Q&A, going back between the chat. I feel that my brain is scrambled at this point, so thank you all for bearing with me, and thank you for coming to this event. And definitely thank you, Iris, for this presentation, and we'll send out the links to where they can find your book as well. So definitely check that out and buy it. And thanks for attending and supporting OHA and Iris in her work. So thank you, and have a good night, everyone.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
It was a
Iris.
pleasure meeting you.
Fabulous job.
Thank you.
And yes, this will be recorded, so we'll send that out with the link as well.